Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle McDonald. I'm a contributing writer for HEW and editor of Travel Technology Update, an industry newsletter. I'll be your moderator today for a very informative hour that will focus on the shift to open source software in the travel industry, sponsored by Amadeus. The shift to open source software is one of the most important current trends in technology. It can enable faster innovation and reduce the total cost of ownership. Yet the concept remains mysterious to many of the very people who could benefit from it. So today, we're going to discuss why open source software is gaining momentum and address specifically three questions. What is open source? And what are some of the practical examples of open source solutions in the travel industry? Why is open source important for airlines? A few words about our format today. You can use the On24 software on your screen to send us your questions and comments at any time during the webcast by using the questions functionality to type them into the system. You can download the slides for this webcast directly from the software by launching the PDF on your screen. These can be downloaded during the webcast, and it won't interrupt the presentation. If you want to review the slides and listen to the audio again, you can replay this event by going to the webcast archives section on hewonline.com, where it will be posted soon. There may be some variation between presenters owing to their local telephone systems. To control the voice level of the audio, turn up the volume on your computer speakers. And if that doesn't work, or if you're experiencing any other problems, please click on our help link down at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get it sorted out. At various times during the webcast, we'll be asking you to respond to a few poll questions to get your feedback on your experience with open source. We'll be presenting the results just before we take your questions. We appreciate your feedback. After the presentation, we'll send you a form to let you tell us what you did and didn't like about this webcast. Please complete it to help us improve the value of these webcasts for you. And now, let's move on to our main event. We've invited two speakers with specialized knowledge of open source. Professor Jim Norton is author of an Amadeus report titled Open for Business. Jim comes with 40 years' experience in the telecommunications and IT industries, having had key roles as supplier, user, and regulator. Today, he spends much of his time in pro bono professional roles. Jim is immediate past president of the BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT in the UK. He's an external board member at the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, a non-executive director of F&C Capital and Income Investment Trust, where he chairs the Audit and Management Engagement Committee. He's also chief external examiner for the UK Institute of Directors Certificate and Company Direction Program. Denny Lacroix is Vice President of Reservations, Distribution, Mid- and Back Office Systems at Amadeus, with responsibility for research and development for systems that process more than 1 billion transactions a year. His previous role at Amadeus is leading the development of sales and electronic commerce platforms. He joined Amadeus in 1989, and he pioneered the use of web technology there. So Jim's going to talk about what do we mean by open source, why the move to it is so important, what the advantages are for enterprise customers, and what the challenges are in making the transition. Denny is going to cover what open source means in practice and what the advantages are for IT providers and customers. He's also going to talk about Amadeus' experience using open source in real-time transaction processing. Jim, would you start us off, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Now, I'm not sure whether everyone on the call may be fully familiar with open source, and so if I could perhaps just start with a brief summary. Open source and open systems are not new. They have a track record stretching back 40 years for Unix and 20 years with Linux. And open source software has particular characteristics, notably independence of the underlying hardware platforms, a good degree of portability, and it usually comes with a right to edit and to redistribute the software. It's also based on a set of three principles: no intentional secrets, wide availability on royalty-free terms at reasonable and non-discriminatory cost, and a clear assurance that all patents must be royalty-free or covered by a promise of non-assertion, quite an important factor these days. I should say, though, this does not mean that open source is free. There's still a substantial cost of ownership. It's just potentially rather less than that for proprietary software. And the distinction between open and closed systems is not absolute. Many existing closed systems, such as Apple's OS X and iOS, draw on the Unix and BSD heritage. Now, the advantages of open source, which we'll expand on later in this webinar, make the move away from proprietary systems one of the most important trends in technology of the last 5 years, and certainly of the next 5. And as we'll see, that shift is not easy, but for most organizations it's certainly worthwhile and often essential. So I'll just hand back to Michelle for the first poll question. Okay, our first question is, of the software your company uses, how much do you estimate is open source? Up to 25%, 26 to 50%, 51 to 75%, or more than 75%? And back to you, Jim. Thank you. So why is this move to open source so important, at least in my view? And I'll show you on this slide a number of key points. If you like, key advantages to enterprise customers, such as airlines and those across the travel industry on the call today. That combination of open source software, open systems interoperability, and open standards has created a self-reinforcing community of shared research and development right across the world, plus a pooling of creative ideas. This leads to a great stream of new innovation, which is widely and rapidly available. As you'll see on the slide, Jim Whitehurst made that point. He also went on to say open source is the default choice of the next generation of IT architecture. It's important also to maintain as wide a pool of potential vendors and partners as possible. The open source community really helps in that respect, and it leads you to a sort of co-creation with your partners. As you'll see on the slide again, many markets now have their own momentum. The choice, I'm afraid, is to keep up or just to be rolled over. With open source and its associated wide range of shared development tools, time to market critically can be cut very sharply. Even more important, the time to fix bugs or problems highlighted by customers can be reduced dramatically, again drawing on that global pool of knowledge of experience, and that leads to greatly increased responsiveness as perceived by the customers. Finally, this ability to support a wide range of systems. The world today is a highly heterogeneous environment. Multiple smartphone platforms, multiple tablet platforms, PCs, smart TVs. Business organizations also often have legacy systems stretching back over many years. The ability through open systems to draw on an extensive range of standards and interfaces shared and developed over the last 20 years can indeed be a key differentiator. And back to Michelle for another question. Okay, our second poll question. What do you feel is the most compelling benefit of open source to your organization? Faster response to change and quicker time to market, flexibility to integrate with a wider range of systems, access to innovation more quickly, reduced total cost of ownership. And back to you, Jim. Thank you. So, if you decide you do want as an organization to address this challenge of transition, what are the key messages? Well, there are quite a few people who've gone before you, and they've learned where most of the potholes and pitfalls are. So perhaps the first message is to use an integrated development team to support the current systems as well as developing the new open system. So if you allow the staff that have been responsible for supporting the old systems to be trained in the new programming languages, new methodologies, new tool sets, you demonstrate commitment to avoiding them becoming a stranded asset as the old systems are progressively retired. It's also very important to maintain some institutional memory of why particular design and implementation choices were made. Those may indeed still be very relevant to the new developments. And finally on this point, if you give the development teams a role in support as well as development, that kind of ensures they're fully aware of and live with the consequences of any implementation defects. Second point I'd like to make is about realism. This is, for almost all organizations, a major undertaking. It It often represents a very significant business change, not just an IT change. And so often, in my experience as an engineer, I've seen good IT change ruined by poor business change, but then of course you blame the technology. So it's really important to understand the scope of the business change. You've got a system, new systems must be developed whilst maintaining high levels of service to customers through the existing systems. And if I can quote the words of Henry Kissinger, the urgent often forces out the important. Everyone was busy before, now there are lots of extra change-related tasks as well. Emotions rise as workloads increase and people are inexorably sucked into the imperatives of the day-to-day business rather than fully addressing the change. So some realism about cost and time scale is essential. Only transfer what you need, so minimization. It really is important to take the opportunity to weed out requirements that were once relevant but simply are no longer. It's amazing how much content of systems is no longer used. It's also important to carry out a needed rationalization and simplification of the requirements, changes that have accumulated in the old system over years, and of course to include the new features and capabilities to support current and anticipated customer demand. If I can hand back to Michelle again.
Thank you, Jim. And now for our final poll question. Do you think your company will increase its use of open source software? Yes, I envision a rapid switch to open source. Yes, but a moderate switch over a long period of time. It is unlikely we'll increase reliance on open source software. We are seeking to reduce our use of open source software. And now we'll move on with our next speaker, Denny Lacroix. Denny, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. You can see we have people from all over the world. So I'm going to take you through what it means to actually using open source to a large extent in mission-critical transactional systems as the one we have at Amadeus. The first thing I'd like to say is that obviously we're talking about open source software, we're talking about open source systems, and we're talking about technology. In our case at Amadeus, this was a business decision as opposed to only a technology decision. This is a strategy that we actually had to endorse at the CEO level and to get absolutely everyone on board to support this move towards open source software and open source systems used in mission-critical environment. Now, it is one element of our IT strategy. It is probably not the biggest one. I mean, there are other fundamental strategies that you need to have, such as, what is your approach in build versus buy? What are the fundamentals of your core architecture, the fundamentals of your operational architecture, you name it. But this is one element of our IT strategy. For the ecosystem we live in, we believe open source and the fact that we've used extensively open source software and open source systems across the company has been a driver of change for our customers, for our partners, for our suppliers, and for ourselves. In the next few slides, I'll try to use some example relevant to this audience as to what are the changes that we believe are directly attributable to the extensive use of open source software and open source systems at Amadeus. Now, let's talk about the advantages to IT providers. And here, I put Amadeus in this category, IT provider to the airline industry. And let's talk about really four things: people, technology, solutions, and money. Let's talk about people. Now, we employ a very large number of software engineers at Amadeus, and like many successful businesses in the high-tech or in the IT field, we have a constant need to ensure that we have access to the best and brightest software engineer from, very much anywhere in the world. As it turns out, if you're doing college hiring, as an example, you come across young graduates with a master in computer science, from somewhere in the U.S., somewhere in Germany, somewhere in India, and you will find that those people have had, at least 5 solid years of IT education using pretty much exclusively open source software. And the fact that when we actually talk to those people, we can speak their language because we use the same systems and the same software that they've been really being educated on for many years, is actually a very, very strong point in our ability to attract them and join the company. The other point I'd like to say is it's about retention. Again, there's a worldwide shortage of great software engineers, and there are many very large companies with big brands going after them. So if you've been able to attract them, you have to keep them. And in our experience, if you're actually able to have your engineers use open source software, they're actually less likely to leave you, and they are more likely to actually stay much longer with the company, as opposed to maybe if you actually, quote-unquote, lock them in some proprietary technology. Software engineers just hate to be locked in. They hate to be running out of options, and if they have this feeling, they'll just jump ship and maybe leave the company and work somewhere else. So, this ability to access skilled, motivated, innovative staff and keep them, is one of the key drivers of our use of open source software at Amadeus. The next point is about technology. Now, if you look at the open source software and open source systems out there, what is actually quite amazing is the ability of the community out there to ride every single new wave of technology development, whether it's hardware, software development methodologies. So really, by using open source to a large extent, inside Amadeus, we're actually riding the open source software, and as a consequence, because of the open source software community is riding, technology developments, we benefit from the technology development. This we've seen a number of times. More often than not, open source software is actually ahead of anything else on the planet. So that's, allows us to actually weave new technology into our infrastructure, into our architecture, much faster than using commercial software. Better problem solving. Now, that's an interesting one. The open source software, the couple of rules that dominate the open source software world. One is the Darwin rule. The systems and the open source software packages that will survive are the ones that are actually able to adapt. And there's a second rule, which is survival of the fittest. So the successful open source software packages or open source systems are the ones that are either able to adapt very quickly to what's happening, or they're actually just better than anything else. And as a result, if you're actually making the right choices, you do improve considerably your ability to actually solve problems, and you get access to really unprecedented capabilities. Now, this is something to be taken with a bit of care, because you have to be very careful in your choice of which system you're going to be embedded into your own IT infrastructure. There's a lot of abandonware out there, which is our open source packages or software that were very, very popular, let's say, a few years ago, and that virtually no one is using anymore. And if you've used this extensively in your infrastructure, well, you have a problem. Now, you don't have a massive problem because you have access to the source code of those systems, but you may not want to be actually the only one on the planet to maintain those systems. Last but not least, lower total cost of ownership. Now, license fees matter, but that's not the thing. But let's talk about license fee, the big elephant in the room. There are cases where the fact that there are no license fees with some critical open source systems is absolutely vital. Let's take a scenario, maybe something pertaining to the airline industry. If you are in the business of being able to provide the best possible low-fare search engine in the market, or if you would like, for your airline inventory to open what we call, 100% polling, i.e., let the airline poll your inventory 100%, or let GDSs poll your inventory 100% all the time, you're going to need to deploy thousands of servers, and maybe 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 servers. If the software, the base software on those servers, does not carry a license fee, it can make a huge difference in whether you're actually going to be able to offer this solution or not. So license fee does matter. The other thing that is very important, which Jim made very clear as well, is that specifically when you're looking at operating systems and things like Linux, you get hardware vendor independence. We are completely hardcore at Amadeus about hardware vendor independence, and we really, really want to be able to get the best possible hardware we can at the lowest possible price, and we absolutely do not want to be locked with a specific vendor. So we have a mixture of machines coming from a large number of vendors, And they all look the same to us from a software standpoint because they all run the same Linux distribution, and we really don't care what hardware is underneath. Now, I did say that, license fee and, hardware vendor independence is not the only thing. It's important, it's not the only thing. There are other components to take into account, indeed, in your TCO. First, obviously, you would need to back up your use of open software with some mission-critical support contract. You don't want to be on your own with some open source software if something goes bad. So those mission-critical support contract that you need to put in place with vendors which support those open source systems are not cheap, especially if you have very high demand like we have in our environment, 24/7 mission-critical constraints. That means that those contracts are not cheap if you want to be to get support, any time of the day, instantaneously when you request it. So it does offset a little bit the money you're saving on maybe hardware and license. Something else important, and we'll come back to it in the TCO, is that, well, if you actually use open source software well, you can actually create value that would be unattainable without it. So, it's not about cost only, okay? You really want to control your cost, but then, how do you value the capability to do something that maybe nobody else has done yet, your competition or other people? So, cost is one thing, but, remember the value you're able to unlock if you deploy open source software correctly. I'm going to be moving on to the next slide. Now, advantage to the consumer or the customer. I think I already mentioned this. If you use it well, you're actually able to create new capabilities, new products, new solutions, new offerings that would just not be possible without it. And there's many examples. I mentioned one, in the low-fare search space, for example. This is a very typical example that if you were using, commercial infrastructure software, you just would not be able to do it because it would not be economically viable for Amadeus as a provider, or if you would actually have a product offering at a price point that is just nowhere close to what the market expects. The price point is actually very important. We don't want necessarily to be using open source software to be at the lowest possible price point. You want to be at the price point that the market will bear, and sometimes, and increasingly so, we are finding that it is through open source software that we can actually, be at the price point that we want to be, given, plenty of other things, including, obviously the kind of margin you want to have, and so on. Move on to the next slide. Now, where do we use open source today? So, very much strategically, our intention is to use it absolutely everywhere. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of systems which are exclusively built using open source software, and others that are using a mixture of commercial software and hybrid software. Let's talk about, for example, our airline IT suite of products. Some of the systems we have that are today, 100% built on open source software include our airline inventory system, airline revenue management, airline revenue accounting, departure control system, weight and balance, and many more. So really the core of our airline IT platform is actually built using open source software. There are other pieces, such as our core reservation capability, which at this stage are using a mixture of commercial software and open source software, but we are completely hardcore about moving everything towards open source software. In the e-commerce space, or online solution, as it says on these slides, we use pretty much exclusively open source component, open source systems, open source software. There may be a few exceptions, but by and large, this is all built using things like Apache, JBoss, you name it. I want to mention something about the philosophy of working with open source software. There is an expectation out there that if you're using open source software, you should also contribute to the open source software community in a couple of ways. Let me give you an example. We are quite happy, in the case of Linux, for example, to actually contribute with our own code to the Linux kernel, for example. And this is something the community expects. That is, the community does not like companies that have a very selfish view on open source software. If you're using open source software, you expect to contribute. And there's a number of open source software packages and systems out there where you will see Amadeus contributing with real assets in the forms of source code. Another thing we've done is we took a very strategic piece of code called Amadeus Aria and actually open source this critical piece of technology because we saw an opportunity to actually leverage the community and make this package even better than what it is. So for those of you interested, make sure you go on ariatemplates.com and find more about it, and by all means, contribute to this system. So, conclusions. From our standpoint, we think it is the time for the travel industry at large to be embracing open systems and open source software, and that it does really have the ability or the capability to unlock innovation. And obviously, as we all know, innovation and speed are very fundamental to our ability to compete. The other thing that I think is maybe somewhat rare, but maybe not unique, is that we are using open source in very large volume, transactional, mission-critical systems. We have key open source systems, to give you an idea, that process more than 100,000 transactions per second, and this is entirely built using open source software. And this is super mission-critical in our environment. And I think, we shouldn't be the only one in the travel sector to actually embrace open source systems, open source software. It really is applicable to many, many sectors of the travel industry, not only the airline industry. Michelle, I'm going to hand over to you again.
Thank you, Denny. And we're nearly ready to take some questions, but before we do that, I'd like to send you the survey form I mentioned earlier so that we can get your feedback. I'd also like to reveal the answers to our poll questions. Okay, of the software your company uses, how much do you estimate is open source? Wow, there really is a move toward it. It's 56% say 0 to 25%. 30% say 26 to 50%, 6% say 51 to 75%, and 6.6% say 75 or more percent. And the next question, please. What do you feel is the most compelling benefit of open source to your organization? Well, the largest percentage of you, 39.1%, say reduced total cost of ownership. And in second and third place, faster response to change, quicker time to market, and flexibility to integrate with a wider range of systems. 17.3% say access to innovation more quickly. And the final poll question, do you think your company will increase its use of open source software? 15% say, yes, I envision a rapid switch to open source. 54.5% say, yes, but a moderate switch over a long period of time. 24.2% say it's unlikely we'll increase our reliance on open source software. And 6% say they are looking to reduce our use of open source software. Okay, now on to the questions. We have a couple of very nuts and bolts questions that I think Denny would like to tackle. How is your data protected in an open system?
Well, okay, to be frank, I don't see a strict relationship between the use of open systems and open source software and data protection. I mean, data protection, the data that our customers is entrusting Amadeus with, okay, we take care of, and that is really a separate discussion from really open systems. I mean, by open system, we definitely not mean something that is open for everyone, okay? So no real link, as far as I can see, between data protection and protecting the data that our customers entrust us with and open systems.
Okay. Now, does open source mean that the servers are located somewhere else and that the user will be accessing the system remotely?
No, not necessarily. But although obviously, in our case, whether it's our IT business for airlines or our distribution business, okay, we are strictly a software as a service company, which means that we actually host the application software in our own data center, so users and our customers are actually accessing the system remotely. Now, you could do this, and in fact, many years ago, we did this with commercial software. So open source software does not automatically imply that you will be delivering your services using the software as a service model or platform as a service model. But in our case, the answer is yes.
Okay, thanks. Jim, since the publication of your report and your subsequent speaking engagements, what has been the common feedback?
A good deal of support for the report and the fact that it had put quite fairly both the importance but also the challenges of the move to open source. And also, one thing we haven't really addressed in the call today, because the report also deals with cloud, the subject of one of your questioners, I guess, and that is that whilst the technology of cloud is great, there are all sorts of concerns over the business model, and including things like the security of the data and what happens if your cloud provider goes bust and that kind of thing, which I think was a very sensible question from one of your callers in.
Okay, here's a question I'd like both of you to address. Where do you see the main negative points in using open source software for a company and or its customers? Denny, you want to start?
There's a couple, I think there's a couple of pitfalls that you have to stay away from. Okay, we use open source software extensively, as I said, but we have put some governance around the usage of open source software. I mentioned those young people we hire, all around the world. Okay, they'll be using open source software when they join us, Amadeus, as a software engineer or as a senior software engineer. But what actually they end up using, and deploying for our system is actually quite controlled. Okay, so it's not a free fall if you want. Okay, so I think the pitfall may be that you want to be controlling what your organization is doing and not be jumping back and forth between the thousands of options you have out there. So you need to put some form of governance in place. I think Jim also mentioned this in paper. You also have to be careful with some of the license terms of the open source software you intend to use. So that is definitely something to be very, very aware of. In terms of other negative things, it's hard to say. We see mostly positive things. Jim?
Yeah, it's Jim here. I don't think negatives. I think there are points that you need to deal with whatever system you're building, and open source doesn't get you out of doing those things. So as Denny was saying, you do need a proper architecture. You do need software controls. You need change controls. And probably you also need to be doing this in systems that you plan to keep up to date, because open source does move, and that was something Denny mentioned. You don't want to find yourself isolated at some point in time. So it's choosing the right tool for the job.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Another question. Amadeus is essentially a software company. Will the Amadeus system be available as an open source program to non-subscribers or perhaps non-users?
Well, never say never. But for the time being, the answer would be no. However, as I indicated, we are already computing some of our assets to the open source community, okay, but not obviously the entire system. Now you have to realize that the Amadeus system. If I look at at our assets, number of lines of code that make up the Amadeus system as a whole, okay, you're talking about something that's actually much bigger than anything else. It's a lot bigger than, for example, Linux itself. So it would be very overwhelming for anyone to be actually, download that software and get going. You're talking about, hundreds of millions lines of code. This is absolutely gigantic. Plus, obviously, this is what Amadeus lives on. Okay, so whether we would actually be making this quote unquote free available, there's some interesting business questions behind that.
Okay, thanks. Recruiting young engineers is fine, but where do we get the industry experience in developing the systems? That's a chicken and egg question, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit chicken. Okay. Right. Okay. The first thing I'll say is that we don't only hire the young engineers. We also hire people that have experience. Okay, and it is true that we don't have any problem hiring someone that has a lot of experience operating or developing mission-critical systems, even though they may have zero exposure to open source software. I mean, the characteristics of a massive transactional system, of a massive mission-critical transactional systems, those are things that you don't learn overnight. I mean, you have to go through the pain of going through scalability issues, reliability issues, and so on. And that's really, yet another skill set beyond the ability to actually master open source software. So,
can I add to that, Denny? I think because we both made the points in our presentations that the last thing you want to do is to set up a completely new team recruited from scratch to build the new systems and isolate the old team just maintaining the legacy systems. It's getting a combined team to do both that brings the mix of new skills plus that leveling of knowledge and experience, which is so crucial to success.
And on that note, what is the role of so-called legacy software when considering open source software?
Okay, I wouldn't create legacy software. I mean, maybe let's make it a very simple discussion. You've got commercial software and you've got open source software. Clearly, for some time in Amadeus, both worlds will coexist. Although at this stage, I would say that definitely, the focus of our work is definitely, in actually writing, code on top of open source systems and using open source software. So the key thing is to make sure that you have, a great architecture where, both worlds will actually coexist. But that's really the extent. It's really an architectural decision, no more than that.
Okay.
Can I add something? And that is that, in the network world we have today, many companies, the systems they want to link together are not the ones they necessarily choose. They're the ones they have. And so it's one of the key advantages of open source that in general it can plug and play with a very wide range of proprietary systems.
Okay, how broadly can this be used? Do open source systems also support, for example, maintenance and engineering systems for airlines?
I couldn't tell you from Amadeus' standpoint because that's not something that we do as a business. But I suspect that open source software has found its way into systems already.
Okay. Jim, I'm sorry, Denny, I have a question. You mentioned earlier that sometimes software packages go stale. They aren't used anymore. How do you know when something's outlived itself?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, I mean, in most cases, the engineers will tell you so. They say, well, we've been using this system, this piece of middleware, and it doesn't seem that there's more traction in the marketplace. When I say marketplace, I'm talking about the open source community, and they start to feel uncomfortable about the fact that slowly, we may actually end up being the only one using it on a large scale. So it's really by keeping the pulse of what's going on out there and see the trends emerging and see the way things are going. And what is actually interesting is that the open source software community is actually not making quote-unquote big mistakes. In other words, there's this thing called wisdom of the crowd. The thing that gave us things like Wikipedia. And when it comes to technology and open source software, it's definitely true. I mean, the masters have wisdom. I mean, they are not going to paint themselves in a corner. So if you actually monitor this and actually are very much in tune with what's going on, the likelihood of actually making the wrong bet is greatly reduced. But that can still happen. And by the way, it can also happen with commercial software. I mean, you can actually have commercial software that is considered at a good point in time absolutely state-of-the-art, and 2 years later, not so anymore. Okay, so it's not something that is specific to open source software. But I have to say, overall, the community seems to be making quote-unquote the right bets.
Great. Okay, can you both talk a little bit more about what the ownership costs are involved in moving to open source systems?
Shall I lead off on that, Michelle?
Yes.
Sure.
Just a thought around that question. It was interesting when a study was done by the United Kingdom government on this. I noted in the responses to poll questions it was total cost of ownership that came out highest. Curious enough, when we did that in the UK, total cost of ownership came out high, but it wasn't the highest. What was the highest was the avoiding single sources of supply and achieving vendor independence. That was what felt to be most important. And indeed, the total cost of ownership, I'm sure that those on the call can find me a system where the total cost of ownership wouldn't fall with open source. But of course, in general it does, and it might be that the sort of industry figure that's quoted is maybe 10%. But a lot of the ownership costs here, as Denny was saying earlier in the call, are around the support contracts and systems that are needed to maintain that open source.
Yeah, I completely agree with Tim. I mean, and something I already alluded to is that, the value of being able to do something new and innovative and maybe be ahead of the pack and actually getting customers faster on board because of use open source, I mean, that has a lot more value than actually have the lowest possible TCO. Now, TCO matters, okay? There's no question about it. But, your ability to actually staff your company with really great people, the ability to actually create product solutions at a price point that is very attractive, where you're going to have this, very attractive situation where your business is actually growing fast, okay? That is a lot more important than actually TCO. But TCO is important.
Okay, thanks. Jim, can you talk a little bit about the ownership costs involved in open source systems?
I guess actually Denny might be better than me on this, but it's really around these costs of having someone on there are several vendors out there who will look after the open source that you're using, handle releases and updates, make sure, if you like, that you're properly synchronized in the open source you've got across all of the applications that need to sing together. There's a sizable job there.
Okay, Denny, you want to take a stab?
No, I mean, I think Tim was pretty right on spot, really.
Okay. Okay, here we have a question that suggests it's probably a naive question, but what is the open source movement limited? Is the open source movement limited to English-speaking industries? What is the activity of open source in, say, China, for example?
Okay. I have to say, I am. Maybe someone on the call has clarity. I don't have clarity as to what is the state of open source software in China. What I know for a fact is that open source software is used in China for sure. Now, whether whether there's an active Chinese open source community, I don't know. I don't see why not, really, but I don't know. Now, the other question, is the open source movement limited to English-speaking industry? No, but as you know, specifically in IT, English is like the lingua franca. It's the language, or broken English, I should say. Being French. That's what people actually use in the IT field. So, nothing to be proud of, really. But de facto, even, for example, in what we contributed ourselves to the open source community via template, I mean, we created an English site to actually make this available to the world. And I don't know if it was US English, British English, but definitely it was English. No choice, really. So it's like, I don't know, let's call it English the lowest common denominator.
Well, I have to say, Denny, your English is a lot better than my French. Okay. Does open source imply an open non-conformance to standards like ISO, things like that?
No.
No.
No, absolutely not. No, absolutely not.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. Lots of standards that come into play, but PCI DSS, which is obviously something critical in the airline industry, definitely open source does not imply non-conformance. Absolutely not.
Absolutely. And indeed, the whole history of this comes out of the Open Systems Interconnection movement around the time of Unix and then into Linux. So the two are intimately linked.
Yeah. And if you think of security, I mean, it has been argued, and I'm sure it was actually proven, that by and large, open source software and open source systems were actually more secure than commercial software. Now, how exactly do you prove this? I don't know, but I'm definitely aware that some people have made this point and argued that way.
Yeah, I think the point that's being made there is that to assume you achieve security by obscurity is usually an exercise in self-deception.
Yeah.
Okay. Denny, does Amadeus just use open source software, or does it contribute to open source software, like to the development of publicly available software?
Yeah, we definitely contribute. And again, because Amadeus, is a large company, with thousands of software engineers, there is like like an implicit code of conduct. If you are a large user of open source software and you are a successful company and you have, some, decent financial muscle, you are expected to contribute. Now, we don't make a big fuss about it. We actually let our engineers contribute very much as they wish, but we very much encourage them to do so. And by the way, it's not costing us anything because they are so passionate about it that they actually tend to do it on their own, at home, on their own time.
Here's an interesting question. Are there any intellectual property issues around open source development? Jim, you want to take a stab at that?
There are a number of different types of license, and they are actually detailed in the printed copy of the report. But the key with open source is whether you have let me just tell you the three types of license. There's a general public license, a GPL, and that requires that altered or extra code added to the software is also licensed under that GPL. In other words, it's made available. And that ensures the propagation of open source, but it can cause some licensing conflicts if you combine proprietary software with open source software. There's another level of license, the Berkeley Software Distribution License, called BSD, gives anyone freedom to release updates or modification of the software under any license they wish. And for anyone who's got a Mac, if they boot it up in single user mode, they'll find Berkeley Shell coming up before it starts the Mac. And then the lesser GPL, LGPL, is a compromise between the restrictive general public license and the permissive BSD. And altered LGPL software must continue under lesser GPL, but extra code can be added under almost any license the author wishes. So there's a range here that you need to look at quite carefully. But the key point is you should not end up being caught by some patent troll saying you're using something which is a patented technology. Because you don't get into the open source community unless you've made it clear that, as I said in the presentation, these are royalty-free terms for unrestricted use.
Yeah, Jim, sorry, go ahead, Denny.
No, sorry, Michel. No, I have to echo what you said. I mean, I mentioned before that we have a fairly solid set of processes and solid governance around the actual use of open source. I mean, you have to. That's the not so pleasant side of things, but you do have to read the fine print. And by the way, if you're actually procuring commercial software, you also need to read the fine print. But in the case of open source software, you really need to have some of your legal people, take a look and just, sign off on a couple of decisions you have to make from a technology standpoint.
Yeah.
Okay, Jim, for the benefit of our audience who may not understand what a patent troll is, could you explain that for us?
No, pretty much anyone who reads the Wall Street Journal these days can see them. It's those who are busy suing each other, or companies that have bought up a stock of patents and then trying to enforce them against a wide range of people. So different standards apply across the world as to how easy it is to get a patent, particularly in the software patent area. And particularly if you're a small organization that would have trouble defending some of these suits, you really don't want to get involved in that.
Yeah, I followed some of this. It's a pretty ugly situation for a lot of people.
You might be amused, Michelle. When I teach MBA, which I do here in London, for most people I tell them not to patent. Because actually patenting just runs a big flag up the mast saying I've got something really interesting here and I may not have the cash as an innovator to defend it. So maybe you just come and rip me off.
So if you have something cool, you should keep it a secret?
Well, or you just get it out there very quickly. There's no point in patenting if you can't defend the patent with a lot of legal money.
Yeah.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, Denny, as a manager, do you see differences when managing software developers using open source software compared with those who use proprietary systems?
Well, there are some differences, but they're fairly minor. Some of the engineers, they actually, they would like to remain marketable all the time. Okay, so they want to make sure that they have all the right keywords on their resumes and so on. And what they would like to see on their resume, it may not be what you want as a company that they do. So you have, there are certain expectations. So if there's, for example, if there's something that's the rage out there and that they just dying to start using, you need to, stand your fence. Okay, this is fine, but let's make a conscious decision. Let's not have just a rogue team of 3 or 4 going that direction. So you have to be a little bit careful. You do want to control how exactly open source software is used, and sometimes because of this mental image they have of the open source, this light control you're putting in place, I mean they find it painful. So that's the thing to actually be careful with. That's very much the only difference I can see. And by the way, most of our people actually will use open source software in the morning and commercial software in the afternoon. Okay, so there's no real conflict between the two.
Oh, great. I'm sorry, Jim. Do you see a place for using open source this is hardware in the future in data centers? I
don't follow the concept, Michelle, of open source hardware, but if we're looking at data centers running open source software, absolutely, and most data centers do, even when they're proprietary. So, for example, if you take a look next time someone logs into Microsoft Bing, what you're actually logging into before you get anywhere near their search engine is an open source system. So even the most dyed-in-the-wool guys tend to use a lot of open source, and a lot of that is in data centers. And certainly for going into the cloud, it's pretty much all open source.
Yeah, there's a couple of things, not strictly hardware, that actually we're looking into. If you're faced with the problem of deploying, let's say, 10 or 20,000 machines in your data center, which is really a problem we face, then you start looking at reference hardware design, which are actually kind of specialized for this environment where you're going to have thousands and thousands of machines. So that is not really open source hardware, because at some stage you're going to still, someone will still have to manufacture whatever you end up installing. But there are some, quote-unquote open source reference hardware in the way a server is put together, how the power supply hooks up to the motherboard and so on. So there are reference design. Actually, Facebook has a reference design out there, which you can actually use for your own servers, and this is a design that they use when they deploy a massive number of servers in the environment. Now, it's not strictly speaking open source hardware, clearly, but there is open source ideas in the hardware world as well.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Jim?
No, I think that covers it very well.
Okay. Does the size of an airline matter when considering open source technology? Jim, you want to try that?
I might try it, but I don't know the answer. I'm going to revert it to Denny.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. If the question is, for example, let's take the concrete case of an airline that is considering using some of the Amadeus services. Does the size of the airline matter? From our standpoint, no. Whether you are very small or very big, we will put open source software to its best use to serve you. Now, if the question is about an airline considering open source software for its own IT department, then I would also say that size doesn't matter. I'm not sure there's a relationship really between your ability to leverage open source. I'm not sure it matters very much whether you actually are a customer of Amadeus or a would-be customer of Amadeus, or you're actually using you have your own IT systems. I don't think it matters.
Okay, and Denny, could you talk a little bit about the Amadeus Aria templates and how they work?
Okay. It's a. I'm going to be a little bit technical, but I'm trying to not to be too technical. We created this framework to be able to actually target our e-commerce platform towards mobile devices. So things like the Android, Galaxy mobile, Galaxy tablet, iPhone, and so on. And we had a real problem to get really the best of both worlds. That is, deliver a great consumer website experience on the desktop, and also deliver great application for Android, great application for the iPhone, great application for the BlackBerries, and so on. So this was becoming a real nightmare. So we actually created the software to actually make it easy for us to actually be able to target all those different form factors at a reasonable cost. So that's how this created. And having done it, and having actually successfully used this framework in our own product, and sold this successfully to actually a very large number of customers, we decided that this was unique enough that maybe by contributing this to the open source software community, then people would actually rally around it and actually improve it faster than we could ourselves. So that's the big bet behind making this key piece of technology public.
Well, it's early days yet, but do you have any sense of how it's going?
Yes. So first of all, we've been very happy to see people actually contributing source code to it. And the other thing that we started doing is that it's a dog eat dog world out there. So we're actually being very active in actually promoting this. I mean, there's actually no money to be made for us at Amadeus, okay? But we're sending people to conferences to actually so that they can actually present this and get people to take a look. But so far, we're quite happy about the uptake. And by the way, there's been some uptake of the technology completely outside of the airline world, which actually caught us by surprise. I guess that's to be expected, because the problem we were trying to solve was not an airline problem only. It's a problem that any business that's conducting mobile commerce or has. So we've seen some uptake outside of the airline industry as well.
What kinds of things have you seen?
We've seen some banks taking a look at this, and a couple of rail providers.
Rail, I get. The banks. Yeah. That's kind of strange.
I don't know. Banks have very large IT systems, and they also have a need to make sure they have a great desktop presence, a great mobile presence. So maybe this software is also solving a problem they had as well.
Interesting.
It's just Jim here. There's an interesting piece, in fact, that was published by McKinsey's only a few days ago, which very much endorses what Denny is doing there. And they talk about accelerating cycle time and co-creating with customers, getting your customers to work with you in developing. And it's this importance of agility and speed.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Our panelists have provided us with their contact details, and we'll be emailing them to you so that you can follow up with them if you have any further questions. Also, please remember to complete your survey response so that we can continue to bring high-value content to you through these forums. Before we sign off, I'd like to thank our panel once more, Professor Jim Norton and Denny Lacroix. I'd also like to let you know that the webcast on-demand version will be available at atwonline.com within the next 24 hours, and it'll be available for a year. And please go to the white paper section of atwonline.com to download the white paper on this subject. And thank you all for joining us today.